For those who may not be aware or who are aware, I am happily a small part of a growing organization for propaganda studies and an attendant listserv in which I have been watching and trying to keep up with much of the discussion on that has been taking place there. Among scholars focused on history and current application of various propaganda, and wanted to bring them on here. And in part because I'm also and also thinking perfectly in line and in tune and in sort of a need with my class this semester on public opinion and persuasion. I thought this would be a good discussion to have. So we have at least 2 guests here so far, and maybe potentially a third coming up in just a moment. One of them is author and scholar in the history of propaganda, whose latest book I am working through now, and which is given the name for this program. Her name is Alexandra Kitty, and the book I am working through, which is one of several of hers, including Outfoxed, which I have used in my media studies classes going back many years now. But this new book is called War Propaganda. So she'll be joining us, as will be Professor Oliver Boyd-Barrett, who, among other things, is a professor emeritus at Bowling Green State University of Ohio, and whose work on media imperialism I am currently using as well, but who has a piece we're going to talk about this morning reflecting or regarding the crisis in Ukraine. So I welcome you both to the show. Good morning to each of you, or afternoon or evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm glad we can all be heard now, and it's all worked out. So, why don't we start, Alexandra, with you, if you don't mind, given that I have taken the title of your new book for this video, and it's sort of the overarching theme of war propaganda. Tell us about the work and what it is that you have put together here, and why it's important that why you've done it and why you think it's relevant in terms of what's going on right now.
Because first of all, war is very harmful. And, people's lives get ruined for absolutely no good reason. You're trying to raise, your family, you're trying to live your life. And then all of a sudden you find that you are an outgroup, you are an enemy. And, when I started looking at this, I was only in university. I was like 17, 18. I was a psychology student. And I noticed that PR firms were managing wars. And I thought, well, how does this get through? And how do people believe it? So because I was a psychology student and I was studying this, I realized all the answers were in my psychology class. It's just it wasn't applied to journalism. So I said, why don't I become a journalist in order to see how this happens? So I conducted studies as a journalist, and then I saw that propaganda is not like other forms of communication. Propaganda actually works on your brain as much as it works on your mind. I always use the example. Have you ever had somebody insult you and you knew that they were jealous or you knew that they just were ignorant, but it still bothered you, that your brain processes this to be upset, but your mind knows better? Well, propaganda just hits your brain first so that you are biologically constricted into seeing the obvious ruses and lies.
Before we move on, I want to ask you, and it did cross my mind that this would be particularly relevant given that this is supposed to be Women's History Month, but you describe in your book propaganda as patriarchal, and I was wondering how it is you've come to see it that way, and why you use that particular frame in describing propaganda.
Well, I call propaganda patriarchal for the simple reason. In a world of infinity, you would think we would have more than one right answer, more than one solution. Your reality is not the same as my reality. But when you have sort of that patriarchal, only one size fits all for everybody, no matter who you are, where you came from, what are your strengths and weaknesses, that's a patriarchal system that's rigged that you see only one correct answer. Any everybody else who's even slightly different is sort of down on a pecking order. And that's why I call it patriarchal. It's a simple thing that there is no plurality. It's propaganda works only if we see one solution, which is destructive, which divides people, and which makes people constantly afraid. Once you're afraid, you don't think the same. Your prefrontal cortex gets hit. And that has your memory, your decision making, all gets whacked. So you can't remember life pre fear mongering. So propaganda is patriarchal in that there is one authority, one correct answer, and only one possible solution, which when you think about it, that's like giving everybody the same dosage of medication, whether they're children, adults, their weight, their history, the condition of their heart, anything. And that's what a patriarchal structure imposes, a single correct answer, which, that is like everybody having to wear one size, and it doesn't fit all.
Right on. Oliver, again, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please add on to anything you would want to in terms of this broader discussion of what propaganda is, and maybe even in terms, before we get to the specifics of your latest on Ukraine, in terms of your even previous work in media and imperialism. How does maybe an issue or the focus on propaganda fit into that broader analysis of media imperialism?
Well, I'll just pick up from Alexandra's last observation with respect to propaganda is all about just seeing things from one side, one perspective only. And when we look at US media, and I'll get to the point about imperialism in a moment, but when we get to the behavior, the astonishing behavior of US media in our lifetimes, Jared, it's so remarkable, isn't it? Don't you remember after 9/11, how we were all corralled into, within hours, we were corralled into a single dominant narrative as to how 9/11 had occurred. The same with respect to the US invasion and later followed by the occupation for 20 years of a sovereign country, namely Iraq. And again, the mainstream media just fell over themselves, rolled over in front of the White House, Pentagon, State Department propaganda machine, being told and telling us that this was all because of Saddam Hussein's possession of weapons of mass destruction, which he could use almost any time. I think Tony Blair was telling the British public that we had about 40 minutes of protection time before Saddam, and it was never explained to my understanding. It was never explained why Saddam Hussein actually would want to do this. Other than very loud insinuations, of course, totally ridiculous and totally false, that Saddam Hussein had something, no one ever was clear as to what, but had something to do with 9/11. We've seen the same story with COVID. How sickening hasn't it been over for 2 years, the insistence, and we now know that mainstream media were paid, Jared, to cover the COVID story positively. So if they were paid to do that for COVID, don't you think maybe they are paid on a routine basis? Perhaps this explains the on-cue convergence of all the mainstream media around the one single narrative, which happens to be the single narrative that is being pushed out by from Washington. And now again, we see the same with respect to the Ukraine crisis. It's absolutely impossible right now through the mainstream media to see this crisis from any perspective other than the Washington perspective, which is it's a humanitarian catastrophe that is caused by the evil Russians. Why are Russians evil? Well, because they are just evil apparently, and they do evil things. And that is the stupid, the simplistic, the intelligence insulting framework that the mainstream media drives to our brain, as Alexandra was just saying, day after day after day. Very few brains can resist that pressure unless they've been like us. We've been given time off to think through these things a little bit more carefully.
All right, I'm going to come back to that because there's some of these specifics, because I feel compelled to ask sort of what I think sometimes is easily dismissed as particularly for sort of activists or those already sort of consciously involving themselves in critical thinking and in some sort of organized fashion. Is sort of taken for granted, and similarly on another, but similarly there's this kind of taking for granted that takes place on this quote unquote other end, or the other end of the spectrum, where people who are not consciously aggressively involved in critical thinking or political organization or activism just assume that this can't work, that they can't be susceptible. So on the one hand, there's this sort of, yeah, we already know that, yeah, we already get it. Propaganda, we get it. It's serious, it's effective. Okay. And on the other hand, it's like, yeah, everything's propaganda, and I'm impervious to it, as particularly as is taught in the United States, an independent, free thinking, exceptional human being. So I'm just asking the both of you, Alexandra, I'll start with you. Why is it important to understand propaganda? Why is it important that there be a focus on propaganda? And then even beyond that, how is it that it works? I mean, in a society now where, again, in the United States, we're constantly told we're free. The Western world is constantly said to be free and democratic. We have all these options for media. Propaganda is only something that happens over there with them and those regimes. So how would this even work beyond the importance of a focus on it?
Well, it starts with the fact that we focus way too much on, let's say, analytical literacy, which is basically analytically, we can only make two judgments if two things are the same or different, or if one thing is bigger or more than another. So that means that if we focus strictly on analytical thinking, we get very competitive, and then we get on this hamster wheel where we have to outdo the other person because we're either 1 or 0. So analytical thinking kind of puts you on that hamster wheel where you don't see things. We also have emotional literacy, which we're not exactly taught in schools. The closest we have is psychology. And that sort of gives you a feel for things, positive or negative. And you can trust your own emotions when you understand them. Because people go, well, he's not rational, he's too emotional. Well, emotional doesn't mean irrational, but the lack of emotions is the sign of being a psychopath. So we have not looked into the emotional aspect of propaganda or the primal. We are also sometimes primally illiterate, not realizing that we can stand on our own 2 feet. And when we're given a sink or swim, which is what propaganda hinges on, a confirmation bias where we're not given information that refutes a hypothesis, and a sink or swim where we either do this my way or no way, the no choice, we tend to then think, oh, we have no other option but to go with what the propagandist decrees. When we get scared, we don't think. When we are taught how to use our emotions and how to use our survival instincts, our evolutionary drives, propaganda becomes less effective, because propaganda, the whole narrative is you're helpless. You're going to die unless you do exactly what we tell you to do. When we say, no, that's okay, you go your way, I go mine, and you can stick with it, propaganda doesn't work. When you are not afraid, propaganda becomes less effective. If you are not, you're not prone to 1 and 0 bigotry, it's less effective. Well, us versus them. No, it's us versus us. Why would you look down on another group of people for whatever reason? Why are you afraid of them? Why don't you, if there's something people are upset, usually they have a very good reason to be upset. That's where emotional literacy comes in. We don't go, well, he's being upset, I don't understand why this group of people are being upset. Well, why don't you go up and ask? Maybe, we have no problem if we step on someone's foot and the person says, I hurt. You go, okay, I'm sorry, I removed my foot. But when it's emotional, people go, well, this person's being irrational, this person's being selfish. we don't understand the realm of emotions and how they impact war propaganda. So I guess the short answer is we need to look at different kinds of literacies in order to combat propaganda.
I just want to add very quickly that from your book, you say you define war propaganda as the deliberate, choreographed, and strategic, deep psychological manipulation of individuals and groups in order to gain mass compliance and uniformity of thought, to rig beliefs in order for a targeted in-group to draw the conclusion that prejudice against an out-group is necessary in the proper action to involve violence and war. Oliver, can you add or respond in addition to that question again of why a focus on propaganda and how, and maybe a little bit of how it in fact works?
Right. Yeah. Well, again, picking up from that was a great definition, by the way, of propaganda. Thank you, Alexandra. So I want to pick up on propaganda. It works simultaneously both on our brains and also on our emotions, very strongly, very insistently. When it works on our brains, it's basically telling us this is what you need to pay attention to, and therefore it's saying, well, don't pay attention to that over there because that'll confuse you. Just pay attention to what I'm telling you. It may be true what I'm telling you, and that's all you need to know. That it may be true, but of course, the thing that is not being said might very well influence my judgment as to how significant this truth that is being pushed into my face actually is. So that's how it works. That's how it's working. Sometimes we use the word framing when we're talking about how the media play a part in propaganda. They frame events in one particular way that grabs it, monopolizes our attention, and we can't think of anything else while we're focusing on this particular frame that the media are impressing on us. Now, the other very, very important aspect of this, of course, is how propaganda plays on our emotions. So, for example, we have, and it's very sad and it's very tragic, but we have some current examples going on right now in Ukraine where the mainstream broadcasters here are pushing at us all of the time. Pretty much, I would say, I mean, I haven't studied this scientifically, but I would put out a statistic around maybe 5 out of 6 elements to the Ukraine story are humanitarian issues now. So yesterday we were being shown what looked to be tragic footage of the bombing of a hospital. Now, that may very well have occurred. I'm not saying that that did not occur, but I also know through my study of propaganda that this atrocity stories, particularly when they affect women, particularly when they affect babies and young defenseless people, atrocity stories are absolutely necessary for war propaganda. You can't do it unless you have atrocity stories. We have to look at these. If you study propaganda, you know that you can't just accept that these propaganda stories are necessarily true. And we probably won't actually know the full circumstances of the bombing of the maternity hospital. We probably won't know the full circumstances of this until it might be several days, it may be weeks, it may even be months, because typically the full circumstances of these incidents doesn't emerge until way after the propaganda was necessary. So
I'm sorry to cut you off, but Alexandra, because I'm thinking, because you mentioned that infamous example to Oliver's point of the baby incubator story from
the Gulf
Iraq.
War.
Yep.
And that was classic.
Yeah. And after learning about that years ago, and then personally feeling, again, because it's all about my own selfish experience of having been part of being sent over there, like that was, so I take it personally, like they sent me over there in part, justifying it in part with that nonsensical story, and then to find out later. I mean, there was that one, and I don't know. Did you write also about the Jessica Lynch story? I mean, all of these. I mean, it was, but specifically because of the Oliver's point about the children, the incubator story, and to find out what really happened there. it makes it hard to your point, Oliver. It makes it hard to accept anything they're telling me now as legit in terms of what's happening with Ukraine. But so I know I've just interrupted you, Oliver. But maybe can Alexandra, could you just quickly remind us of the incubator story, and then we'll come back, Oliver, to what you're saying about. I just want her to remind the
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No. So anyway, well, during the first Gulf War, there was, the U.S. government wanted to intervene, and they were doing quite a few stories. None of them took. And then came the babies in the incubator's Hope, where there was a 15-year-old girl, Naira, who was testifying in front of Congress and saying, well, she was a volunteer there, and the Iraqi soldiers came and they stormed the hospital. They left the adults unharmed, but they somehow needed those baby incubators. So they took the babies out of the incubators, not telling us how did they take the babies out of the incubators. They put them on the floor. Well, couldn't anybody pick them up? No. Did they throw them? Well, if they did, she would have recounted it. So that was the excuse. Well, they were slapping babies, So we all had people got outraged, and then I believe it was John MacArthur from Harper's Magazine kind of was suspicious, and then he found out, well, Hill and Knowlton was the PR firm behind it, and nothing was true. And I just wanted to make one more point. Propaganda is easily embedded in journalism. There's a concept called newspeg. So if one media outlet reports something on a certain way, in a certain framing, everybody else will. So it's, follow the leader is actually ingrained in the scaffolding of journalism.
Yeah. Anyway, so Oliver, when we come to now these stories of hospitals being targeted or hit or whatever in Ukraine.
Can I just because Alexandra has just been reminding us all about the babies from the incubators propaganda. I remember it was Canadian Broadcasting that did an extremely good documentary that exposed this as propaganda. And unfortunately, about a year later, that's how these things work. You get to find out the truth when the truth no longer matters. That's the name of the game. And but in this instance, an image that's particularly, in addition to that young girl who turned out to be it turned out, we didn't know, it wasn't known at the time that she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Why on earth she would have been in Kuwait City while it was being occupied? I mean, that in itself is just unbelievable. But the other thing that I so much remember from that case study, from that Canadian Broadcasting exposure, I don't suppose Canadian Broadcasting would do this kind of thing anymore, because the whole thing has been taken over by neoconservatives. But I just recall that the image of random people, it seemed, in the United Nations, when this was random people claiming to have seen themselves. Yeah, I personally saw the bodies of these, so the point being, Jared and Alexandra, people's capacity to lie. You don't get to positions of power unless you know how to lie. It's an absolute prerequisite for the exercise of power in our supposed system of democracy. So that's the main thing I wanted to say about the incubators. Jared, if you want me to do, I can go back quickly to the earlier question you put to me about this notion of imperialism and media imperialism, and why I like to use that phrase. Very, very briefly, when I talk about media imperialism, I'm talking about two interrelated things. First, I'm talking about the power about some very, very powerful, internationally disseminated media. Most of them are based here in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in France. That's where most of these come from. Very, very powerful media that are component parts. They are cogs, usually in much, much larger corporate machines. And they have way more resources for the gathering and for the dissemination of information around the world. So, for example, I recall some years ago looking at how the media were covering issues to do with drones and the slaughter of innocent civilians as a result of our reckless use of drones in combating supposed insurgencies, in this case Afghanistan. And I recall looking at Pakistani coverage. How were Pakistani media, because Pakistan was one of the primary geographical areas where drones were being used, and so how were Pakistani media covering this? And there was plenty of criticism of Washington. There was plenty of criticism in the editorials as to Washington foreign policy and the use of drones in this supposed war against terrorism. But the presumption as to what the facts were, the Pakistani media were totally seduced into presuming that what they thought were the facts were actually the facts as being told to them by the Western-based major news agencies and the main Western-based news broadcasters, who are the only people who appear to have an evidentiary base in terms of fact gathering. That is to say, foreign correspondents actually somewhere remotely close to the events and incidents that they're supposedly covering. But unfortunately, how those facts are relayed through the editorial process is a whole another kettle of fish altogether. So I talk about media imperialism in that the media themselves are so powerful that they act imperialistically. And the related point is that most of these media are seeded in the empires, both the former empires such as Great Britain and France, which of course are now allied into or embedded into the American empire. And the primary purpose of media and American empire is not so much to propagandize people around the world, although they do that, but it's primarily to propagandize the American citizens. Because this whole pack of cards falls down if the media are not hard at work persuading American citizens that it's perfectly okay to use drones to slaughter men, women, and children at wedding festivals and such like. It's perfectly okay because, well, first of all, it's exaggerated. And second of all, we actually hit some important terrorists. The fact that these so-called important terrorists seem to be hit time and time again doesn't seem to factor in to media consciousness and therefore not into the consciousness of American citizens. Propagandizing of us at the heart of empire, that is the principal way in which the media serve the interests of power and of empire.
But Oliver and Alexandra, we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. That's the other part of the refrain, that we have to be, it has to be explained repeatedly that we have to do this, otherwise we have to fight them here. And they're even saying the same thing in terms of Russia and Ukraine right now. So I have one other question before we get to the specifics of what's happening right now. I did want to ask you both about just sort of historic precedents to the power of propaganda, specifically in war. You've both written about this, and I wanted to start again because selfishly, my own minor indirect involvement. I remember because Alexandra, I saw in your book you talk a little bit about what happened in former Yugoslavia, and I remember that at the end of my own military career was that we were the second. Yes, I forgot the exact year, but the second cruise or war effort I was sent on was one of the chores, the tasks as it was told to me, and this is all I got, was that we were dropping leaflets. I saw them loading. I worked in the weapons department on an aircraft carrier, and I saw them loading what would have normally been bombs, but they were pallets of paper on, going headed up to be loaded onto aircraft. And I remember asking, what is that? and we were told in no uncertain terms, you are not allowed to know. I don't think anything would have been written in English anyway, if I could have read it anyway. But the point was, we weren't allowed to know what the messaging was that was being flown over and dropped on the people of then Yugoslavia. So to this day, I've always wondered what impact that might have had. What was the point of all of that? And even back then, I was wondering. It never really occurred to me why this would have been happening. I'm used to seeing bombs get loaded and dropped, but not, paperwork or whatever. Anyway, so could you talk a little bit about some maybe historic precedents and examples and important moments in wartime propaganda that are leading us up to this moment?
Well, the war in former Yugoslavia, I think, is probably one of the very good examples of how successful war propaganda was. So many of what the Serbs were really demonized during that war. They were the only ones who didn't have a PR firm. There were many PR firms involved with that, particularly Ruder Finn. And we've seen the power of, and there was an interview with one of the people from Ruder Finn. He gave an interview to a French journalist called Jacques Merlano. And he said, well, people wouldn't even know where on the map this place was, but we managed to get public opinion on our side. So, and I mean, it was, it's quite interesting. You have all these reporters going there. None of them speak the language. And at the time, not that many people spoke English there. So how do you know what's going on? And there was, like, for instance, over 1 million mixed marriages in there. This wasn't some clear-cut divide between, the Serbs, the Croatians, and the Bosnian Muslims. These people were intermarried. These people lived together for decades. And what happened? So this was not very clean. This was a very complicated, messy affair. These were neighbors. I watched footage there. There were neighbors who were shooting each other and crying when they were shooting each other. And then they would get drunk together in the evening because they didn't really want to fight this war. So you have to imagine the effect of propaganda where people are crying as they're shooting each other and then, having things to do with each other in the evening because this was not natural. So propaganda just totally makes you do things that are totally irrational because you're so scared out of your mind. You think the other person's going to get you and probably didn't. It's like that old poem, The Man He Killed, where, you know that you have no business being mad at this person because this person would probably be your friend in real life. So propaganda, we have to look at the biological aspect of how it overrides rational thinking.
Could you also just quickly, because you mentioned Ruder Finn, why, you say here, you say Ruder Finn was hired by the Croatian regime to manage their image to the West during the conflict. I don't even know how much, I don't know, it just sounds an odd thing. Like, I don't think it's something that many of us would think to consider as part of the war effort. While I'm, fueling and arming and training, the military, I have to also brand the effort. And I need a PR firm that's going to be hired to brand my war effort. I it just sounds...
It's like you're marketing a hamburger, you're marketing a war. Mm-hmm. There's that, the showmanship and salesmanship that war takes, because who would want to go into war? Normally, you would want to try to resolve things, go to arbitration, at least, go have a lawsuit or something, because, at the end of the day, when, you lose out. So we tend to be hedonistic. We want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So how does war propaganda have it, where outside is inside and inside is outside, what's up is down and what's down is up? Our perspective totally gets skewed. And only afterwards we go, what was this all about? But that's after the propagandist leaves, common sense prevails. So we forget that we are, very flawed. We do have limitations in how our hardware processes information. So we don't think that there's other people who spend billions of dollars every year having focus groups, testing people, looking, okay, how does this work on people? How do we say it? Do we look at them straight in the eye, a little offset? Do we smile? how do we get into these people's brains and try to manipulate them and milk it for and take the resources for as long as we can?
Oliver, please, you feel free to say add anything you like to that. But I did notice that in this recent piece you wrote in Covert Action magazine that you even talk about you reference an anti-Russian PR campaign going back to the 19th century that is connected, in fact, to the anti-Russian campaign happening right now. Yeah. So as you reflect back on these antecedents to today of war propaganda, yeah. I don't know, what is there to see or lay out?
Well, I mean, so Alexandra has been talking about an incredibly important element to all of this, which is the use of public relations companies as propagandists, and of course they simply do what their clients tell them to do. A classic case we've already talked about: babies being thrown out of the incubators, propaganda in Iraq War I. Back in 1991, and that was orchestrated by Hill and Knowlton, another great big, I think it's Washington-based PR agency. But who are they working for? Well, they were working for the Kuwaiti royal family, and they were also working very close, very hand in glove with the White House. So we saw this, as Alexandra was saying, we also saw this through the Balkan Wars, and there's something very, very important, I think, here, that when we're talking about the Balkan Wars, which began to take off, as best I remember, from 1992 onwards, and it was the first major case following the Cold War. Don't forget, the Soviet Union was dissolved illegally in 1991 by Boris Yeltsin, who was a puppet of Washington. And some of us might at that time have hoped for a different world under the wise and benign leadership of the House on the Hill, self-congratulatory and self-righteous American plutocrats. But no, it wasn't a different world. All we got was a different language as to how the business of power would pan out. And the new language was the language of humanitarianism. We have a responsibility to protect the innocent. I mean, that would be fine if that's what we were doing, or if that was all that we were doing, that is to say, helping the innocent. But the primary motivation, of course, was to achieve power. In this instance, to break up Yugoslavia, which was an amazing. The history of Yugoslavia is simply amazing as an example of advanced socialism in Europe, and it could not be allowed particularly after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it could not be allowed. And the thing about Yugoslavia was that it forged its own path between the forces of Russian or Soviet communism and Chinese communism. So it had to go. And also, besides, Yugoslavia was kind of between us, namely Western Europe, and the Caspian Sea, and getting access to oil and to gas from the Caspian and bringing it over to Western Europe was another big part of that story. But the main point, and I want to go back to how you introduced this with respect to my recent article in Covert Action, is that propaganda is not cheap. That whole thing about the babies in the ink, that was many millions of dollars. A simple message, but to get that across to a mass audience in a way that they're going to accept, that takes big money as well as big persuasive expertise. But this thing about Russia, well, there we've kind of made it cheaper because we have 200 years of history of Russophobia. In the West, we are born almost from the cradle, hardwired to believe that in some mysterious way the Russians are innately evil. Of course, this is absolutely and atrociously wrong and false and stupid. But before so we had the Cold War, and we were told during the Cold War that this was all about a titanic struggle between the benign forces of democracy and capitalism against the malign forces of autocracy and communism. That is to say, that is to say, the abolition of private wealth in favor of the public good. That's the basic principle of communism. And we were told that the Cold War was all about this titanic clash between these two ideologies, in which we, the West, were good, and they, the Russians, and their satellites were bad. But actually, it's much more complicated than that. And a large part of that titanic struggle, and it was titanic, but was it about capitalism versus communism? Because if it was, then everything would be just perfectly blue sky, wouldn't it? After the dissolution of the communist Soviet Union in 1991. So how is it, therefore, that communism disappears and yet we continue to be at war with Russia? Well, part of the reason is because it wasn't just a titanic struggle between two ideologies. It was a titanic struggle between two power systems, the Soviet and the American, for access to the minerals and to the wealth and to the resources of the third world. That's what it was largely about. And now, after the dissolution, as I said a moment ago, I think it was a tragic historical error. And Mikhail Gorbachev, whom I have interviewed on this, admits that it was the last thing that he had in mind when he set off perestroika in the mid-1990s. The last thing that he had in mind was the destruction of the Soviet Union. And what a shame that his project didn't have time to materialize and to progress. But that's we can get into that maybe a little bit later. But the main story here is that Boris Yeltsin, who is supported by the West, he's not a deep intellectual. He has a problem with drink, and he takes power. He seizes power. He has to shut down the Russian government in order to seize power and to progress the capitalistic project with the benefit of Wall Street advisors and Wall Street propagandists to persuade the Russians this is everything that they've always wanted. They've always wanted to be part of the materialistically well-off West, and they wanted to be modern. And here Boris is bringing this modernity to you. And what's the price of that reckless transition from one system to a totally different system, namely from collective planning to free, unregulated capitalism? Tens of thousands, if not more, of Russian lives. There was unfortunately at this moment, I can't remember what the percentage was, but there was a dramatic increase in those 10 years under Yeltsin in the size of the Russian population. Such was the terrible damage that was done to the people and to the economy of Russia in this reckless rush to capitalism. And but the West was delighted by all of this, and the West was responsible for making sure that Yeltsin was re-elected in, I think it was 1995 and 1996, advising him in all manner of ways as to and funding his election campaign in all manner of ways to make sure that he was re-elected, and so he served another 4 years, unfortunately, until he lost to he didn't lose, I should say, but the next president was of course Vladimir Putin, who was he was a capitalist, anti-communist, but he was a nationalist. He believed in the restoration of Russian power, quite right. Because he had seen the damage that the West had already done in the 10 years under Yeltsin, and of course at that point the Cold War began again, and the incessant propaganda at every level, not just through the news system, but particularly through our entertainment system. Hollywood is a major agency of propaganda in these respects. When was the last time that you saw a Russian hero in a major, unless of course he was working for the CIA, in Hollywood movies? you have to struggle hard to find a good example. Hollywood, I would say, is actually the prime agency of propaganda, along with the rest of the entertainment, the U.S. Led entertainment media empire. And so under Putin, the West has restored the Cold War, if you like. We haven't just begun. People talk about the new Cold War. That's nothing. It's not new. It's pretty much been going on, just with a brief period of interruption during the Yeltsin years, continuously. And before the Cold War, of course, then we had anti-Tsarist Western propaganda, and that, which goes back before the Crimean War. This game, this terrible, tragic game, which it is an Iron Curtain, and now we have another Iron Curtain that's just been dropped within the last few days and weeks, actually. It is a historical, it's a preposterous insult basically to our species. The fact that we cannot be friendly, to be human with one another across the Iron Curtain, to Russia, to the peoples of Asia, to the peoples of China, that we should be forced into regarding these people as other, as different to ourselves. This is a monstrous crime against the human species that is perpetrated by Western capitalism.
I think for many of us, certainly within the United States and beyond, it would be hard to even conceive of a U.S. approach to the world that wasn't based on othering somebody. Before we even get to the Iron Curtain, this country can't even get beyond its own borders before it others so many people for imperial colonial conquest. But Alexandra, how? I wanted to ask you both specifically about what's going on now. How do you see your analysis of war propaganda playing out today? And then Oliver, I'll come back to your article and what you have to say about that. But yeah, how do you see it playing out today? The work you've put into this stuff.
Has all the hallmarks. As soon as you have us versus them, and them is completely evil, irredeemable, you know what you're dealing with. There's the element of fear. There's the element of othering. You can look at the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Ukraine at the end of February hired Knickerbocker, which is a very powerful PR firm. So we already know that all the elements of classic propaganda are there. People are made to feel afraid. People are made are ashamed if they challenge and question. You say, well, you're for war. No, nobody's for war. What it is why is this war happening? What's going on? And, people need to question, what do I actually know about the area? People take sides. It's like, okay, find this on the map first. Tell me 5 things about each of these countries. I'll give you a list of things that you absolutely need to know. Answer the questions for me before you make a judgment. But we have absolutely nothing to go on, because when war propaganda, make sure that you don't really know what's going on. You have to take narrative, not fact. So when we're asked to take narrative and feel atmosphere of terror, you already know there's propaganda. And when you have world leaders pretending to know everything and to have all the answers, and this is how it is, you go, okay, I want to actually quiz all of these leaders. Name me 5 things on the list that you know about the situation. Dollars to donuts, they don't know very much either. People smell that maybe there's an opportunity to gain power, to consolidate, and that's why they're doing it. So, this has, as I said, all the hallmarks of us versus them, imminent threat, villains versus victims. But it's sort of in a state of flux that we haven't found our babies in incubator hoax rallying cry yet, which is, I think, interesting. Going 3 weeks in, that's interesting, given that we know so much more of manipulation and the use of nudge units, that this is kind of dragged on, and that it's kind of and I'm just going to say one more thing, that when you see people, let's say on social media, they're acting like this is like, World Cup soccer, I'm with this team or I'm with that team. That's, a downgrade of what propaganda is. This has been almost like a sports betting. It's, to me, particularly fascinating that seeing this part of, okay, you put a sticker on your social media feed, and that sort of does what, people don't know what's going on, and they're trying to find some ground, eroding, shifting ground to stand on. Something has to be certain.
Although now that you mentioned, I bet there are prop bets you could take on this. Like, how long will the war go? How long will it take for Ukraine to give in? I bet there are places you could go and put a bet on that. But Oliver, same thing. What are you seeing? Your article, in some ways, you're sort of countering the propagandized narrative by explaining some of the history behind Russia's current actions.
Yeah.
But and maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but then also, and maybe in the context of what else in terms of war propaganda you're seeing take place in right now.
Right. Well, one of the principal ways in which propaganda works is it just doesn't supply you with the context. So the media, for example, I'll return quickly to Ukraine in a moment, but in the case of Syria, for example, the media story is, all of a sudden, in 2011, without anyone expecting it, there was an uprising, and it was democratic, ordinary people just like you and me. They wanted democracy against this evil dictator, Bashar Assad. No. We're talking about a conflict in the case of Syria that goes back many, many decades, and it primarily has to do with an existential battle to death between Islamic jihadists, particularly in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood and later Al-Qaeda, against a secular or at least a multi-confessional, very ancient regime. Which, amongst other things, had demonstrated enormous, incredible tolerance between belief systems over many centuries. Anyway, let's go back to Ukraine. So in the context, so what is it that the media are not telling us or don't like us to remember when we're talking about the Ukraine crisis? It goes back, it starts at least in the mid-1990s, which we were just talking about just now, just as the breakup of Yugoslavia was taking place back in Russia, remembering that in 1990, then the last Soviet president, Gorbachev, in negotiation with Washington through James Baker, then I think he was Secretary of State at that time, James Baker and many other sources assured Gorbachev that in return for the Soviet Union's recognition of the reunification of Germany, East and West, in return for that giant concession. Don't forget that Germany had twice invaded Russia and or the Soviet Union at enormous cost of Soviet lives. So this was an enormous concession that Gorbachev was making to the West to agree to the reunification of Germany. And what was he giving? What was being given in return for this enormous concession? Mikhail, we, the West, NATO, will not move 1 inch further east than where we already are. At that point in time, in 1990, there were 16 member countries of NATO. Today, there are 30.
Well, but James Baker, by the way, just quickly, has redeemed himself with his investment in Theranos. So we can all. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is, and then in 2008, in the context of the war over Georgia, where Russia was trying to defend its two enclaves against the aggression of Georgia against those two pro-Russian enclaves. In that context, Putin very clearly explained to the West that if the West continued to move further toward and to threaten Russian security interests, then Russia would very likely have to intervene. He was telling us 17 years ago, he was telling the West, 15 years ago, he was telling the West, this is what will happen if you pursue this crazy determination, which is, of course, motivated, as everybody understands, is motivated by the lust, Western lust, for the breakup of the Russian Federation and for deregulated Western capital to do what it wants in robbing and stealing the vast resources of the Russian Federation. That is the name of the game. And
that 15-year forewarning is also likely why there seemed to be so much U.S. Intelligence on the coming invasion in advance, right? I mean, like it seemed like, in advance of this latest, whatever it is, the U.S. was saying it's coming, it's happening, it's coming, it's going to come. He's about to invade. He's about to, and everybody was saying no, he's not going to do it. But maybe they understood that he would because he's been telling them that he would for so long. Is that?
Well, we just found out a few days ago that there was a very large Rand Corporation plan in 2019 for the destruction of Russia, for the destabilization of the Russian Federation. So this has been planned for a long time. Now, did Russia actually invade? Was Russia the aggressor just a couple of weeks ago in invading the Ukraine? Well, first of all, this didn't happen. It didn't start just 2 weeks ago. As I've been trying to explain, this started in the mid-1990s. That's where we can find a beginning to this narrative. And it works through a Western attempt in 2004 to get our own chosen candidate as elected president in Ukraine. We called it a color revolution. It was one of the first of the so-called color revolutions. And that didn't work out too well for all kinds of reasons. So we tried it again in 2014 under the tutelage of Victoria Nuland, whom we know not only was, she actually told us, Victoria tells us a lot of things that she probably shouldn't tell us, but she did kindly tell us that the National Endowment for Democracy was pouring millions of dollars into securing, trying to manipulate the Ukrainian electoral system. Apparently, not terribly successfully, because we couldn't get our own guy or our own candidate into power. Instead, we had Yanukovych. And we didn't like him too much. We called him pro-Russian, though he wasn't that pro-Russian, really. He was simply very smart, and he realized that if he went with the European Union attempt to win the Ukraine fully into the Western camp, there were a lot of strings were being attached to the offer of the European Union to bail out Ukraine, which has been permanently in debt since God knows when. And Yanukovych realized, well, actually, Putin was offering him a much, much better deal financially, much, much better for the Ukrainian people, without all of those neo-conservative, neoliberal strings, like, cutting pensions and just hurting people, which is what neoliberalism does. It just hurts people. That's the name. And Russia wasn't proposing to do that. So Yanukovych very, very sensibly went with the Russian offer, with the Moscow offer, rather than with the Brussels offer. And so we didn't like that. And instead of just waiting for the next election, Ukraine having elections, of course, instead of just waiting for the next election and having an equitable chance to try and influence the battle of ideas, we lent ourselves, that is to say, Washington lent itself, it encouraged, it helped to finance what is undoubtedly a coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 that sent Yanukovych and his administration packing. It was the muscle for this coup d'etat, though there were some genuine anti-corruption voices definitely that helped to start, just as in Syria. But just as in Syria, that authentic grassroots protest against power that started in Euromaidan was taken over and exploited by a vicious, violent, neo-Nazi, Banderite movement. And they won by, amongst other things, by shooting protesters with a view to smearing the Yanukovych side, and then slaughtering protesters in Odessa and elsewhere, and threatening the 40% of Ukraine which is pro-Russian, or at least speaks Russian and regards itself as allied in a cultural sense to Russia, threatening the 40% of his own population with you won't be able to speak your language. Russian will be not allowed in schools or in public discourse. And
you also talk about them being shot and bombed. You know, the region that Putin has, you know, looked to defend or move into or whatever was being people in. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I don't want to monopolize this conversation, but just I'll try very briefly in one sentence. So ultimately, Russia, in response to a request from the people of Crimea, annexes Crimea. It does not seize Crimea. There is a democratic process whereby the people of Crimea have a voice in saying we don't want to be part of this anti-Russian Kiev coup d'etat regime. And it also votes to request Russia for annexation, which Russia does because of the importance of Sebastopol, the major Black Sea port on the Crimean Peninsula, the importance of Sebastopol to Russian security interests. And in the Donbass, which is heavily pro-Russian, we saw the setting up of two people's republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. They were seeking not to be annexed by Russia, and Russia was not interested at that time in annexation. But what they sought was greater autonomy from Kiev. And the Minsk agreements, which were signed onto by Russia and by the European Union, essentially through the Normandy round, these discussions took place in 2015 and 2016. The Minsk agreements required Kiev to introduce a pro-federal system in Ukraine, which is very, very centralized politically, a pro-federal system in Ukraine, which would have given much, much greater autonomy to the pro-Russian enclaves of Donetsk and Luhansk. But Kiev, I mean, Russia hasn't been perfect either, but Kiev has resolutely refused to adopt the Minsk Accords. Not for want of trying. President Poroshenko in 2016 tried to legislate greater autonomy, but as always, he was vetoed by the power of the neo-Nazi right. They are not terribly popular electorally, but they are incredibly powerful and influential on the streets through the force of arms. The right wing has now even been given the legitimate status by being enveloped within the Ukrainian National Front. So they are part of the formal military apparatus, including the most notoriously the Azov battalion, which is near Mariupol, which is where many of the recent battles have been taking place. And Russia has only, but there's that 2016, this 2014 coup d'etat was followed by 9 years of violence against the independent republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, violence by the Ukrainian army, which, by the way, not unimportantly, had reportedly had 100 to 150,000 troops lined up against the Ukrainian side of the border with the Donbass. The same number of troops, in other words, that Russia had lined up on its own side of the border. Was Russia the aggressor? Well, in terms of the invasion of Ukraine, we don't know. We do not know. And anyone who tells you that they know, they don't. Because this is one of those propaganda narrative struggles which has yet to be resolved. But I think there's a very, very strong chance that Putin felt that his arm was being twisted. The West was screaming about how he was going to win. He knew that one way or another, the West was going to get its war. And I think more likely than he simply decided that he was going to be horrible and invade, I think much more likely was that seeing that the West was determined to have its war, he decided to take preemptive advantage. By the way, at a historically important moment when it looks to me like Russia has a superiority in nuclear firepower because of its more advanced hypersonic nuclear missiles. And so I think Putin has he's fighting a war not because he wants to inflict damage and pain and death, although these things very, very tragically do occur, and we all, if we're remotely human, we regret this and don't want it and want it to end. But nonetheless, I think Putin is fighting a war now because he knows the war is going to come anyway. And the longer he leaves the war, the longer he doesn't look war in the face, the worse will be the outcome.
So in other words, just a little bit of a few talking points of context left out of much of the discussion, certainly in Western press. Alexandra, I want to give you a chance to respond or add to anything that you've heard there, but I did want to ask you specifically about what you thought, or if you have any thoughts, because a couple of shows ago, I did make note of the fact that there were a good number apparently of U.S. advertising agencies looking to get its people out of Ukraine at the beginning of this conflict. And I just thought it was interesting to see the advertising age cover this and talk a little bit about. So it was just occurred to me, because again, not thinking a lot about Ukraine or that region just in general, I'm like, that seems pretty interesting. And in the context of war propaganda, I thought to ask you about, your thoughts on this, given, what are they all doing there? I mean, it is, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but it could be considered to be something beyond just selling products. But any thoughts about that or anything else that you've heard from Oliver so far?
Well, it is basically when you have all those people who are there to manipulate people professionally and they're getting out, that kind of also tells you a lack of success because it came down to having to leave. I mean, if it worked, you don't have to go. This wouldn't have happened. So a lot of this is just things are not actually working out all that well. I mean, this is, we can see an economic devastation for Russia and a lot of things, but they were preparing themselves for it. They were divesting certain funds. They were insulating themselves because they could see this. And particularly after 2016, when Hillary Clinton blamed Russia for her defeat. I mean, it wasn't Russians. It was her own, inability to see how to campaign. But
no, I was going to vote for her until I saw a Russian meme on my Facebook page telling me not to. And that's why I didn't do it. I was this close. I was that close,
I mean, I don't think she understood the concept of electoral college very well. You don't go, where you're going to win and you're only going to get so many votes. That's another story. But I think that was the writing on the wall for Russia, thinking, there's going to be something here. But when all these companies are pulling out, they're losing too. I mean, the whole point of when you are trying to get a global scale and globalization is to make sure you have, your tentacles everywhere. So we're seeing basically a deglobalization with this, that, when people are there and they're losing, let's say, certain things that, you learn to do away with it. So here we're having a very interesting blowback with propaganda in that the target of the group is now being made isolated. And yet they don't seem to be all that upset about being isolated from all these things. I mean, what we're seeing is that the problem is that propaganda is usually devastatingly effective, and it's not working as well because we still have COVID propaganda that hit people, but that was flawed propaganda. And that primed people first. That was a nuclear bomb. The problem with COVID is you didn't have an enemy to pin the problem on that took. So now you're seeing regular propaganda with Russia, which is working, but it's not working as well as we would expect. Russia's still standing. They're not retreating. And, we're just seeing this companies actually cutting their noses to spite their faces by leaving there. And so what is your next card to play if you take all your toys and the other side goes, okay, what now? Propaganda has to work on the people, but it also has to work on your target. And the thing is, it's not working on the target the way we would have expected to normally.
So I have one more question for each of you, and then one further question for both of you. And Alexandra, I'll just start with you. In your book, I wanted you to say something about, you talk a little bit about a study, I think in 2005, and the impact of photographs on implanted memories. And I was just wondering if you could just say a word or two about that, because I thought it was fascinating, the ability to manipulate what people think they know about their own past.
It was a very fascinating study. So they got university students, and they asked the researchers asked the parents for a photograph of the children, and they doctored the photograph, and they gave them 45 words, and they said, well, do you remember flying in a hot air balloon? And in 45 words in a picture, the subjects falsely remembered that they had been in a hot air balloon. And this study has been replicated in other things. So 45 words and a doctored picture is enough to alter your memory. It's enough to change your perceptions of reality. And and when you have that, your memory is not a tape recorder. It can be easily manipulated. And when you're afraid, what propaganda does, that hits your prefrontal cortex. First thing that happens is you lose your memory, your ability to remember. So you can be manipulated that way. And you got to remember, those subjects were not under stress. So add stress to that factor. You have no idea what you see. And
sorry, because one of the thoughts I had about that was, so what if this is extrapolated and targeted at certain target populations who are stressed through oppression, colonialism, etc., whose maybe not the specifics of their individual childhood, but the collective memory of a people's history is constantly reformed and retold and imposed on them, that it could have a similar mass effect. That's what I don't know if those studies go that far. If you've seen something, I haven't, but it was just the thought I had, that if it could happen at the microcosmic level of an individual, you add much more institutional imposition of those same kinds of implanted false memories of an entire group of people, that it could have a collective mass damaging effect.
It does.
Anyway.
You can even take Hollywood movies when they do remakes. Why are you doing a remake? You're slightly altering the message. And I'm one of these people who saves articles and original things. I do a lot of research, and you can see how things slowly shift towards what is convenient. So people can misremember things and not realize they're misremembering things. Sometimes that's not what you're experiencing. That's what you saw on television. That's what somebody is telling you. So your memories are deeply personal, and they're your own. They shape you. And to somebody to invade your mind like that and manipulate your memories, maybe a bad memory is going to be made into a good one, telling you should accept being, harmed, or you had a good memory of something where you triumphed, and now you're told, no, that's a bad thing. And you start misremembering it, not realizing that the extent of outside influences on your memory are ongoing. It's not like you remember and then that's it. People have been put in jail and for years because somebody misremembered who they saw who did it. The police say, no, it was this person, and they start misremembering. So you have outside forces of authority condemning people, and the people go, well, I have my memory. No, you don't. You think you have your memory.
Oliver, feel free to respond to any of that or add on. But my specific question to you is that, and I know there's too much context for this to fully address today. But I just you passingly mentioned a little while ago that we now know that coverage regarding COVID had been paid for, and I was just wondering if you could add a detail or something. How do we know that?
Yes, that was a story I saw a couple of days ago. It seemed to come from a good source. Unfortunately, I don't have the details right in front of me, Jared. So forgive me. I will send you the link as soon as I can.
Sure.
After this program, rather than rummage through my notes right now on that particular issue. But I would like to go back to what Alexandra was just saying and what you were just saying. It's always been. I'm constantly amazed that a country that has a history of the genocide against the Native Americans, a country which perhaps more than any other country in the world has had a dire, deeply tragic and depressing history of the enslavement of Black people. A country that is the only country in the world to have actually used atomic weapons against another country, even when it didn't actually help to win the World War II, because World War II would have come to an end anyway.
Largely because of the Russians, oddly enough.
And a country that has invaded Iraq and has destroyed one of the great success stories of Africa, namely Libya, under Gaddafi, and a country that has been partial to the support of extremist jihadist movements in the Middle East with a view to destabilizing Syria and in many other countries as well, where we have played the pro-jihadist, the pro-Al-Qaeda card in order to advance our own covert, our own unspoken foreign policy interest. How is it possible, therefore, that a country with this record, how is it even possible for politicians in Washington to even play the game of being saintly, of having a benign interest and concern for the humanitarian suffering? It's just so vomit-making, isn't it? That you wonder about the mental wiring that enables people in this situation to forget and to have others to forget the power of their own history. If there was any justice in this world, America would take time off from lecturing the rest of the world about how to conduct itself. For I would suggest about 1,000 years would about do it. In order for it to win sufficient grace back, in order then to have the right to lecture others about how to be humanitarian and about how to be human. And now we have this amazing story that's come out in the last couple of days about the biological weapons labs in Ukraine, which of course immediately raises all kinds of questions and concerns from our previous knowledge that we have of biological experiments sometimes being conducted against American citizens. We have this very dark history, don't we, of biological experimentation. And then Victoria Nuland, just 2-3 days, was it just 2 days ago? She admits, oh yes, well, there are actually, what does she call them, biological research facilities. No, they're not. I mean, they are research, but they are also biological weapons labs. And this is actually now confirmed by the Pentagon. That there are biological facilities. There are 20 to 30 of these in the Ukraine, and they are of sufficient concern so that not only is Victoria Nuland saying, we're incredibly worried that the Russians may get hold of these, because you don't know what those evil Russians will do if they get hold of our chemical warfare stuff. And now we got the WHO, the World Health Organization. I see just in the last few hours is saying that they too are concerned and warning Ukraine to destroy pathogens in these laboratories. precisely know. I've heard anthrax has been mentioned, and plague has been mentioned as to what these pathogens might be. There is a very important investigative journalist. I'm not able to pronounce her name. I know that her site is Dilyana.bg. You might want to check this out. She is a Bulgarian, and she's been covering this story about the biological weapons facilities for some time now. And she tells us that these laboratories are situated all along the countries adjacent to Russia. They're not in Russia. They're not in the United States. They're not in France. They're not in Germany. But they're in places like Ukraine and Bulgaria, and so these exist. We don't know what they're doing exactly, but there's every reason to be suspicious. I saw a very interesting video yesterday. Ron Unz, who I think has got a pretty smart brain to him, talking because he seems to find confirmation here as to his very impressive argument that the most likely explanation for COVID is, despite Pentagon claims to the contrary, of course, as you would expect, that it is to do with biological weapons labs in which the United States had a part to play in Wuhan, China, 2 years ago. And that this, of course, this is incredibly controversial, but if we find evidence of biological weapons in Ukraine and across and down along the Russian border that are being financed by the Pentagon, then this would definitely add muscle to the suspicions of those who think that there is something to the Wuhan lab theory of the origin of COVID. 19. And by one, just if I might just finish off very, very quickly.
Sure.
Unz reminds us. I had forgotten this until he told us this just a few days ago. That immediately after Wuhan, where is the next place that you see evidence of COVID-19? Tehran, of all places, our next best enemy. Not only the Chinese, but also the Iranians, quite sensibly, have all kinds of very dark suspicions as to the role that the United States may be playing in biological warfare, and why shouldn't they? And that might very well explain the suddenness and the resoluteness of the Chinese in shutting down in its lockdown policy, which seems to have been actually fairly successful, but of course has offended many in the West who see this as another sign of that existential inclination to Chinese autocracy, which of course doesn't exist in the West.
So just another good reason why everybody should go watch the series Wormwood, which I think is one of the best I've seen in terms of commercial media in making the case for I guess unintentionally, for why Oliver might be, or the argument you're laying out there might be right in terms of biological chemical warfare. But I just have one more question for the both of you, because I had thought and maybe hoped that he was going to join us today, and that is our colleague in the Organization of Propaganda Studies, David Miller, because having his own impressive track record of writing on these issues and researching the issues of propaganda. I did want to ask you both about, the reprisals for those, him having experienced his own recently, but reprisals for those doing the kind of work you both are engaged in terms of exposing the dominant narrative and the processes of propaganda. Could you talk a little bit about what you've seen, maybe experienced in the process of conducting your work, that there seemingly are penalties, professionally and otherwise, for people who look to challenge dominant narrative?
Well, the book came out in 2020, and you didn't see very much in terms of other regular outlets reporting on it. They don't trash me, but they certainly ignore me. And it's not the first book I've written, looking at media. I mean, it's from Don't Believe It to Outfox to a new When Journalism Was a Thing. So when you do this, it's not like you're doing this expecting applause, expecting fame. So, I always have to go through alternative routes to show my work, but it's not like it's something that you're going to see. I don't get trashed for the simple reason is what I do is meticulous research. So you're not going to get me on that. So it's, when you have what you have, you usually get ignored, which is something I've experienced. It's not like people don't know about me. It's just that I have to spend extra time, going through alternative channels to explain things, but it's the price I'm willing to pay.
Oliver, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a shame that David couldn't join us today. He himself is a prime example of this phenomenon under the absurd pretext of of being anti-Semitic, which of course he wasn't. David is very critical of the policies of Israel, foreign policies of Israel, and of Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people, but he's by no means anti-Semitic. So that's totally absurd. But of course, that doesn't stop. Even though Bristol University was advised, it contracted a very senior legal expert to make a judgment on this, and the legal expert told Bristol University that no, there's nothing illegal here. David did absolutely nothing remotely reprehensible here, but Bristol just decided to ignore that and try to bring an end to this man's career. A brilliant academic and intellectual, particularly in the field of propaganda. So this is what we're up against. In Herman and Chomsky, in the famous book The Manufacture of Consent, back in 1988, they developed this what they call the propaganda model. It identified the different filters that help to explain why certain information gets to be publicized and other information doesn't. And one of the issues is flack. They use this word flack. That is to say, the reprisals of people in power against truth tellers. That's simply it. And this phenomenon becomes very apparent in these periods of mass hysteria. We saw it immediately following 9/11, when major broadcasters were simply fired overnight for saying mildly controversial things. And we saw it again in Iraq, and now we saw it in the context of COVID, and now we're seeing it. Anyone who dares to be critical of AIPAC and the influence of the manipulation of other countries' foreign policies by the Israeli establishment. We see it impacting, and now, of course, allied to reprisals against individuals, we have the phenomenon of censorship, out and out outrageous censorship, the closing down of voices, so that more and more we are confined to a very, very narrow sphere of potential controversy and debate.
I would like to add about what happens here. You notice that the person is demonized. So this is classic propaganda at play. So you're completely seen as defective and degenerate when you're not. You haven't. So when people have already made strides to knock them back, you're going to put some sort of spin on this, which is to demonize a person, which is classic propaganda. We also see people who are shadow banned, not just censored, but shadow banned or dismissed as silly conspiracy theorists or freaks of nature, who are silly, frivolous, or don't understand. So there's a variety of tools to keep people who are dissenters in check. So we're going to scare everybody else by demonizing some of you, blacklisting some other ones of you. But what that does have unforeseen consequences is you've made a class of cool, hip, edgy, rebel outsiders. So now it doesn't always work the way it people think it does. Some people do take it. The people who kind of keep pushing back, they eventually get vindicated and they develop another following. So it can go either way. But when we see demonization of people, oh, this person is totally without redemption, that's a first red flag going, okay, is there a PR firm involved in this? Is there a certain lobby group? Who has what? It always comes down to money. So if we see somebody who's being demonized in the press or being abused because of their beliefs, the first thing I go is, who stands to gain by this person being out of the way? So that's always, to me, number one. So who what's the bottom line?
Mm-hmm. And the latest manifestation of this charade is the phenomenon of the fact checker. And we saw a brilliant expose, really, of the limitations of this new breed of fact checker. So we had stories circulating for the last few weeks about these bioweapons labs in Ukraine, and the fact checkers, even fact checkers associated with organizations which have enormous public credibility, like Agence France Presse and Reuters. And these fact checkers, no, there's a load of nonsense. It's all made up. It's all Russian propaganda. There's no support. There's no evidence for this. And now, but yes, so now we have Victoria Nuland saying, well, yes, actually there are these labs, and we don't want the Russians to get hold of what's in them. Because you don't know what the Russians are going to do with whatever it is they're going to find in these labs. So amen to the brief period of glory of the fact checker, who are very frequently, as you've just implied, Alexandra, they represent vested interest. They are not neutral. They are representing particular interests.
And they have no qualifications to be fact checkers. What does that mean? That's like an empty term. They have even less qualifications than journalists. So we have people with less qualifications vetting things. It's like, they don't do it empirically. So it's like, okay, you have a little paper crown on yourself that says fact checker. That's all it is. And when they say, no, it isn't, and it turns out, yes, it is, it becomes a joke. I mean, this is going to be something like leg warmers and big hair, the word fact checker. It's just going to be something we're going to cringe and laugh about in about a year's time.
Well, listen, Alexandra, Oliver, I really appreciate you both coming on this morning and sharing a little bit of your work. We'll make sure that there are links to all of that in the show notes, and we'll have to do this again in whatever forms. I would like to get more OPS folks on here, or the listserv discussions on here. They're quite fascinating and very different from what you see in other media outlets. So thanks to you both. Appreciate your work, and we'll definitely be in touch and have you back again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.